This is a 1869 map of the shoreline of Rouses Point. In the upper right quadrant we see U.S. government property, which included Fort Montgomery. If we follow the shoreline down, we see two areas where a dock is written. One of them is a railroad bridge that crosses Lake Champlain. That is now the area where there is a restaurant and pier, and parts of the old railroad bridge are still standing out in the lake. If you go down a little further, you come to an area where the state dock and the Sportsman's pier are, just a little bit below the railroad bridge. We're going to learn a little bit more about the area of the Sportsman's pier later on in today's program, coming up very, very shortly. But as you can see, there are a couple of protrusions there, and those are for the most part, if not entirely man-made, then certainly the above water parts are certainly man-made. As you can see from this 1843 map, there are no such protrusions. You can see the area that goes out again in the upper right quadrant for Fort Montgomery, and if you follow down you see a road to Champlain. That would, I would guess, would be the Chapman Street area, and there's no large protrusions there between there and the Fort Montgomery area. And of course you can see Rouses Point written there just about in the center of your screen, where Jacques Rouse had his ferry across to Vermont. On page 208 of the Town of Champlain 2000 book, we see an artist's rendering of the Steamboat Hotel, and this is looking at it from the north with the rendering facing south. So this is a northerly view facing south. So this shows that this hotel was reachable by rail and by boat, and it's now the location of the Sportsman's Pier, and we'll be looking at that in just a second. We now move our camera outdoors on this April 10th, 2011, and that little island that we see out there is the remnants of the state dock. We are on the area with the new gazebo, the Rouses Point Waterfront project, and we're pointing our camera now north, and generally northerly direction, so we're opposite direction of what we saw earlier with that sketch of the Steamboat Hotel. There are the remnants of the Rutland Railroad tracks, the original rooftop highway. In the background we see the Korean Veterans Memorial Bridge, and this little peninsula right here is now known as the Sportsman's Pier, and that was the site of that Steamboat Hotel. And we're about to head for the Rouses Point American Legion Post 912, or this little area just about a mile south of the Canadian border with Vermont. In that direction, this little area and the part it played in the Underground Railroad in the mid-1800s in United States history, and we're going to find out all about that immediately.
I won't come back to hunt. Okay, I was just trying to Oh, Babylon, it's fine. So she's going to see the flood. No, I'm trying to catch my calendar. That's some subtle, right? Yeah.
Good afternoon, everybody. I want to welcome you. I'm Jerry Fabro, and I'm president of the Historical Society, and I want to welcome everybody to our little dedication today. It's a very important event for our village and for the North Country. I would like to start with the Pledge of Allegiance. The flag is over here. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The first thing I have to share with you is that the actual panel is somewhere between here and Texas. We were hoping it would make it on time, but it didn't. It's supposed to be here on Tuesday. But what you will see unveiled today is the proof, and it is exactly the way the panel is going to look, and it's about 105 pounds lighter, so it's much easier for us to handle. But after the panel gets here, it's going to be placed at Sportsmen's Pier sometime in the spring. The village of Rouses Point will take care of that, and we'll make sure that there's something put out in the papers to let you know that that's happened. So if you want to go down and see the actual panel and see the site, you'll know that it's up. I have one announcement to make, and then we'll get our program started. The Historical Society, on the 20th of April, here at the American Legion, is going to be presenting an evening with Bob St. John, who's back there. He's the commander and the post historian, and he's going to be talking about all the work that he's done on the history of the American Legion and the veterans in this area. And it's free and it's open to the public, and we hope we have a good turnout like we did today. Okay, our speakers today. Sherry Jackson, who was the Northeast Regional Coordinator, the National Park Service, and the Underground Railroad Network to Freedom program. Unfortunately, because of the federal budget, her trip was canceled, so she wasn't able to join us. But in her place, we have Jackie Madison, who's Vice President and Development Chair of the North Country Underground Railroad Association, who's going to say a few words. And then following her will be Donna Racine, who's our Village of Rouses Point historian. Rob McLaughlin, who's Captain and President of the Greys and Blues of Montreal, will speak about the Canadians in the Civil War and talk about their uniforms and stuff. Jim Brangan, who's the Assistant Director of the Champlain Valley National Heritage Partnership Lake Champlain Basin Program, will speak about the program that they're going to be doing in Vermont to commemorate the Civil War. Don Paxson was president of North Country Underground Railroad Historical Association, who did all the work for this panel. He's the one that did all the research. He was the driving force behind it. If it wasn't for him, we wouldn't have this. And he will tell you about the background of why the panel is going to be here. So, if we want to get started, Jackie?
Good afternoon, everyone. I learned this morning, probably a little after 10:30, that I was going to be a fill-in. So this will not be a world-renowned speech. As Jerry said, I am the Vice President of the North Country Underground Railroad Historical Association. Today we are really here to recognize this site as a location that was used to spirit individuals seeking freedom to Canada and other locations within this area. Slavery was and continues to have a negative impact on individuals, families, communities, and society as a whole. Every human has dreams and desires and anticipates freedom to make those dreams and desires come to life. individuals who lasso another person or others into helping them with their dreams without recognizing that person's goal of access to freedom has done a disservice to their community and society as a whole. But those individuals who intervene and allow freedom seekers to have a chance at their dreams are the gems of society and humanity, and I would recognize them as the first true activists of this community. They did not have to, individuals in this community did not have to put themselves or their families in harm's way to assist former slaves, but they did. And I can only speculate that they had a strong sense of freedom for themselves and others, and their conscience dictated that they must help those who were denied that chance. This is an opportunity to honor those individuals and this community for putting their lives on the line. As an African American, I am proud of those individuals who fought to preserve the mission of this country, which is to provide freedom to all humans. While I cannot identify any of my ancestors who may have taken a route through Rouses Point, there is a chance that it could have occurred, as my family originated in the Carolinas. For the relatives of those individuals, be they activists or freedom seekers, who may be here today, you should know that they were true heroes, and this plaque will honor them and let others know now and in the future that against all odds, it is always best to do the right thing. Thank you, and I would like to say, remember, all humans want to be free.
Well, that is a hard act to follow. I want to thank all of you for being here this afternoon to be part of this dedication process. This Underground Railroad panel, you have to acknowledge the fact that it's going to be here for many, many years. And during that time, it will not only inform people who read it, but it will remind them that people who lived in Rouses Point and in small farms and small communities across the border dared to step forward and become part of a movement that was covert, extremely dangerous, illegal, because they wanted to join the effort to remediate in some way a practice that for too long had flourished and grown to the extent that it did, and that practice was slavery. How successful was the Underground Railroad? Well, if you're a number cruncher, don't ask me whether they moved a quarter of them, an eighth of them, or a half of them, because I'll be tempted to say definitely not. As there were roughly 4 million slaves in the South at that time, and the Underground Railroad of necessity had to move them in small numbers. I don't think they'd have moved a quarter of them, so for the number cruncher, that's not going to sound like very successful. And I don't feel that it's the numbers that count. First of all, slaves who had heard about the Underground Railroad tended to think it was a myth. And if it wasn't, it couldn't work. But once they successfully transported slaves to Canada and word got back, and they knew it wasn't a myth, that it could work because it had, it gave them hope. And people in bondage, men in prisoner of war camps, when they lose hope, it's all over. So it provided a light in the darkness. It certainly was successful. Don't base it on numbers. All right? I have to warn you before I go any further that historians face an occupational hazard. Aggie Shields told me this. I doubted it. I don't doubt it at all today. We become storytellers, unstoppable storytellers. One story built on the other, and as I've said to people before, I end up in left field. And once I'm out there, I can't figure out why I got there. And it gets worse because I can't remember where I started. So, thanks to Don Papson's research abilities, his focus, diligence, and determination, And above all, his perseverance. He never gave up once he got started on this panel. So thanks to him, we can use that panel today as a springboard to Tuesday, where we'll start the 150th anniversary, the sesquicentennial of the Civil War. Because on April 12th, 1861, in Charleston, South Carolina, Confederate artillery under Beauregard opened fire on Fort Sumter, in federal hands at that time. Fort Sumter is a brick fort built on a small island near the entrance to the harbor of Charleston. It was the beginning of the war. And part of what a historian does is to get you to research history, get you into it. It may not be successful to have you become a history buff, but get into it. So unlike 1911 and 1961, 2011 you have the internet at your fingertips. So if you want to know more about Fort Sumter, go home and plug in to the internet. And all I'll say about that is Smithsonian Magazine this month has the bombardment of Sumter on the cover and a good feature article inside. And that's as far as I'll go there. On that day in 61, what matters is that, along with South Carolina, who was the first to secede from the Union, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas had already seceded also. They had formed the Confederate States of America. They set up a government. And shortly after Sumter, North Carolina, Virginia, Arkansas, and Tennessee are going to join them. And those are the 11 states that are going to fight with the Union for the next 4 years. And what are we going to accomplish? To put it in plain terms, I always look at it this way. We have the North fighting to preserve the Union, and the South to preserve slavery, because it's such a part of their way of life. If it weren't, it might have died out. But then Eli Whitney went and invented the cotton gin in 1793, and the need for cotton increased, and the slave-based economy took off. Follow the money. So there are people who say, why do we study this? It's back there. Put the period on it. That's not going to affect us today. Well, let's look back at that Civil War. We lost 600,000 plus Americans. It didn't matter what color they had on, blue or gray. They were American. And to put it in Abraham Lincoln's words, when he was in Gettysburg, he said, the world will never forget what they did here. And we're fighting this war to test whether any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. Any nation, us. So dedicated to liberty and to the proposition that all men are created equal. He put it all in simple terms. So above and beyond those 600,000, we lost a president. Because on April 15th in 1865, Abraham will pay the last full measure. That's why we remember. So April is quite a month. On April 9th, 1865, when Lee surrenders to Grant, the war is over. The Union is preserved. But what about slavery? You don't need the Fugitive Slave Act, the Underground Railroad anymore. They're free to travel. How free are they? Do we put the period there and forget? It just happens at that point in time, the 13th Amendment, abolishing the practice of slavery, was being ratified by the states. And President Andrew Johnson will stipulate that as the states come back into the Union, they must sign that amendment. They must help ratify it. Is that the end? No. Then comes the 14th Amendment. We'll give freedmen citizenship. Freedmen in the United States, and equal rights before the law in federal courts. And then the 15th Amendment, the right to vote. Did the federal government make sure that these rights were put into practice? Go on the internet and find out. But ask yourself why in the 1960s we had to pull in the National Guard to desegregate our schools. Why the freedom marches? Why was Martin Luther King Jr. assassinated? Why didn't his dream come true 90 or 100 years before of one solid society regardless of color? So this springboard to the next 4 years, which is going to be a treasure trove for history war buffs, We have this thanks to Don Patson. So I'd like to thank all of you for being here. I try not to go too far off the path. And once again, it's been a pleasure to know you, Don. It's been a pleasure to work with you. So Mr. Patson, thank you.
My name is Rob McLaughlin. The cane is for real. Although we are reenactors that reenact history accordingly, but the cane is for real. And I guess I could say I'm back from the Battle of Twisted Knee.
You're a little taller.
Just a tad, okay. What I'd like to do is take 10 minutes or so and just put in perspective two things. One is the actual perspective of the Civil War, which some of you may be quite knowledgeable about, and some of you may be moderate, and some of you may not be. And then just say a little bit about the involvement of the Canadians, because when we're talking about the Underground Railway, a lot of the African Americans did end up in Canada, whether it's in Chambly in Quebec, or in the Toronto area, in Ontario, or in Montreal or beyond. So what I'd like to do is just put in perspective the Civil War, and that is, does anyone have any idea how many Americans were killed in the Civil War?
600,000.
600,000 plus, yes. In fact, it was actually about 625,000. Now that's killed. In addition, there was another 400,000 wounded. Now you notice one thing, normally in most battles more people are wounded than killed. But in those days, medical facilities were next to non-existent. A lot of people died of disease, and they died of infection. So out of those 1 million casualties, the number of Americans that were involved in the battle was over 3 million. Roughly a little over 2 million from the federal side and 1 million from the Confederate side. At that time, 1861 to 1865, the population of the United States of America was, anyone know? About 30 million, 31, 32 million. That's 10% of the population that fought in the war. Today, in the United States, there's about 300 plus million. Imagine if there was a war today where there was 30 million people involved, okay, and in casualties, the number that fought, and out of that, 10 million were in casualties. It's phenomenal. In fact, since the U.S. Civil War, for all of the following wars that the United States were involved in, since the total casualties do not add up to the total from one war of 4 years. The Civil War. That's the impact of the Civil War. Unbelievable, the magnitude. They were fighting the war with Napoleonic tactics, but with weapons that were advanced significantly, much more than they were 50 years previous. So, and also to give you an idea of the number of African Americans, there was approximately 200,000 African Americans that fought. They didn't quite take the Underground Railway, but they stayed and fought. Out of that was about 180,000 that fought in the Army and about 20,000 in the Navy. Out of the 200,000 African Americans that fought, 88 were awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. 88, the Congressional Medal of Honor. Not everybody knows that. But I think that is extremely significant. Extremely significant. And actually, surprisingly enough, there were some African Americans that actually fought in the Confederacy. Not a lot, but there were some. The majority obviously fought for the North. So, to come down from that and to take a look at Canada, what was the impact of Canada? Well, it's interesting. Does anyone know when Canada was formed as a country?
1867.
1867. Pretty close to the Civil War. In fact, the Civil War was the most significant event that caused Canada to form as a country. Because Canadians, before the Civil War started, noticed that there was something coming. And obviously there was a lot of conflict between the South and the North in politics, and even if you go back to the 1850s and trouble that was going on in Kansas and what have you, and Canadian politicians, or British North America as they were called then, began discussing the possibilities of what about having a separate country. Because the United States, especially the northern states, the southern states didn't mind so much because there was a distance involved, but the northern states were not really keen about having Britain as their next door neighbor. Okay, because the War of 1812 had just ended 50 years previously, so it wasn't that far apart, like sons heard from their fathers and daughters from their mothers, etc. So the Canadian politicians actually started talking about that actual formation in the early 1860, and then had several conferences during the Civil War itself. Now, interestingly enough, in the first 2 years of the Civil War, Canada was fairly sympathetic to the Confederacy. And the reasons were several. They were not in any way at all in favor of slavery. In fact, slavery had been abolished in Canada in the early 1830s, similar to as it was in the States, but they kept it actually in force there. But what they were sympathetic for was the cause of secession. And one of the reasons were that the southern states were doing commerce with Britain in regards to textile, in regards to cotton, etc. And so they kept that link going. So Britain kind of initially sided with the Confederacy from a support point of view, not from a military point of view, other than armaments. And as well, interesting enough, France, who was one of England's originally greatest enemies, also was in the same link of being interested in supporting the Confederacy. So for the first couple of years, you may have heard of the blockade that existed in the Civil War. Well, the blockade, they had blockade runners. And sort of like a rum runner, but they were armament runners. They maybe threw in a little rum too, but they were armament runners and goods and medicines, etc., coming across the big pond and then getting into the Confederate States, because obviously the North was industrialized big time. They had about 8 times the industrial capability as the South. And so that was, Britain was supplying some of those weapons. In fact, one of the very common weapons used in the Civil War was called an Enfield, which comes from Britain. There was an Enfield and there was a Springfield, and that was come from the States. So to come back to the involvement of the Canadians, what happened was that the Canadian government at that time was called British North America, but there was Upper Canada and Canada East and Canada West actually, forbade Canadians from fighting in the US Civil War. They wanted to be neutral, supposedly, from a government point of view. Well, it didn't quite work. At the time, the Canadian military, that was called the militia, their strength was about 45,000. The total number of Canadians that enlisted and fought, and many died in the US Civil War, was over 50,000. Over 50,000 Canadians enlisted, fought, died in the US Civil War. 33 Canadians won the Congressional Medal of Honor, and 4 Canadians became generals, starting as privates during the US Civil War. So Canada portrayed its part. The majority of Canadians did fight on the north. I had ancestors that were on the north side. A couple were on the south side too, but the majority were on the north. And as a result of the Civil War going on, Canadian politicians, by the time of 1864, etc., when the election was coming around in November for Lincoln, during early 1864, Lincoln wasn't sure he'd get re-elected because the South was still hanging in there after Gettysburg, which was July 1863, which they took a pretty severe bashing, but they still kept fighting. Lincoln wasn't sure if he was going to be re-elected, and the Canadians then decided that if Lincoln was to win, because by the fall, October, it looked like he was going to get re-elected, that maybe they should do something and think about forming a country that would be separate from Britain, which they did. And obviously Lincoln did win, and eventually the Federalists did win, and the South didn't. And what happened was that after the Civil War, a number of the Southerners actually came up to Canada, as well as some of the Northerners, but there was a number of Confederates, including Jefferson Davis, who lived in Montreal for about a year and a half, 1866, 1867, then moved out to the Eastern Townships. On July 1st, 1867, the Canadian government Canada was formed as a country, and originally it was called the Confederation of Canada. Well, that went over a little bit like a lead balloon, and a little while after it was changed to the Dominion of Canada, so everybody was more or less somewhat happy. And obviously the North was quite happy because they didn't have Britain as a next door neighbor. In fact, by 1870, after the Fenian raids were going on, Britain left Canada totally. So that's a brief overview perspective of the Civil War in itself, the impact, the size, which you should keep in mind, what the African Americans did contribute within the Civil War. Actually, it was interesting enough that towards the latter part of the Civil War, 1864, towards the end, the South tried to get their government to agree to enlist blacks that would, African Americans that would become free if they joined, but it was a bit too late. But there were some, anyways. But obviously, the North was really the place to fight for if you were an African American. And as well, after the Civil War happened, this country, your country, changed significantly. It took a while for actually emancipation to take effect, but it was a start in the right direction. Briefly, for us, we are a reenactment organization. We're called the Grays and Blues of Montreal. We're from the Montreal area, from the Plattsburgh area, and from Eastern Ontario area. We portray a Confederate unit called 27th Virginia. We portray 2nd Vermont, of which are sister units across the pond here, over in Burlington. And we also portray 11th New York Light Artillery. So if anybody's ever interested in knowing more about what we call living history, because we live it, I mean, we're here in front of you, versus reading in the book, which we have a few books over there, come and see us after. I thank you very much. Any questions? No? Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I'm Jim Brangan. I'm the Assistant Director of the Champlain Valley National Heritage Partnership, which is a program of the Lake Champlain Basin Program. The Basin Program has been around since 1990, and we've been working with Vermont, New York, and Quebec on Lake Champlain issues since then. And early on in the process, the Basin Program Steering Committee identified that it's important for us to provide interpretation on our heritage in order for people to get a better appreciation and an understanding of what a special, wonderful place we're living in. And that understanding and appreciation builds on stewardship. So the idea is that the more people learn, the better they appreciate, and the better they'll take care of our rich heritage resources. The Wayside exhibit that you'll see unveiled later on this afternoon is one of 200. We've been working with communities and organizations since about 2001 to create a quality interpretive sign program, and you've seen them all over the place by now. They're on the Waterfront here in Rouses Point. They're on the Causeway out in Alberg, interpreting Fort Montgomery. And this award-winning program has been very, very gratifying to be part of, because I'm the one that gets to read them. I've read every single one of them, and I've got to tell you, it's been an honor and a privilege to have this job and to get to know about the rich heritage of the Champlain Valley. As I said, the Lake Champlain Basin Program is the managing entity for the Champlain Valley National Heritage Partnership. This is a new national heritage area. We're only one of 49 in the United States. And in order to become a national heritage area, you have to go through a pretty rigorous screening process by the National Park Service. And you need to be able to A, tell an important story about our nation's history, and B, have an intact landscape that can tell that story. And when the Park Service did their study back in 1999, they saw, in fact, that we are an ideal National Heritage Area location. And so when we went through the planning process, we identified 3 interpretive themes for the heritage area. And these interpretive themes are broad brush strokes of our heritage. The first being the corridor of commerce. We all know the rich transportation history of the Champlain Valley. The second being conservation and community, that link between the human being and the landscape that he lives in. And third, but not lastly, is the making of nations. And the Champlain Valley has played a very, very important role in the creation of our nation here. It's also a site of many of the components of our country that create this wonderful story that links together these different eras of strife and shows that how that we've been able to overcome the difficulties in front of us. And so these interpretive themes will allow us to link together heritage sites so that when people are at Rokeby Museum in Vermont, they can learn about Rouses Point and how this was an important portal into Canada on the Underground Railroad. I'm also on the Vermont Sesquicentennial Commission. I was appointed last summer. The commission has been meeting, prior to the creation back in August of last year. And the commission's been working very well. We have established interpretive themes for each of the years of the Sesquicentennial. And there's been small ceremonies. We rededicated a stone in St. Albans to one of the men who was a former cavalry officer that chased after the raiders that robbed the banks in St. Albans. We've also had a reenactment of Lincoln's inaugural address on the City Hall steps in Burlington on a very cold March day. And lastly, there was a reenactment of Vermont's response to the southern states seceding from the Union. I was in the State House last Wednesday night, in a State House that has been restored to its 1858 appearance. They had the Lieutenant Governor dressed as Governor Fairbanks give the very same address that the governor gave in 1861. And that was followed by the Speaker of the House giving his counterparts response to the governor's speech, and also the President of the Senate give his predecessor's speech as well. So it was a very special and poignant event to see an entire State House filled with people. People are interested about their history and their heritage and wanting to learn more and wanting to make that connection to those people that were living through these very difficult times 150 years ago. And you know, I look back on these, on the work we've been doing towards the Sesquicentennial, and a lot of times when I look at the Civil War, I know the battles, I know the generals, I know the casualty rates, and I happen to be looking at the 116th Infantry Regiment, the local Adirondack Regiment. It was put together in 1863. They had a 28% casualty rate. What does that mean? Everyone's seen my sunburned face. I've spent the last weekend with the Boy Scouts at Tuckerman's Ravine in New Hampshire. And you know, it's been a great weekend. I don't want to bore you with the details of skiing and camping, but this morning I was thinking about that 28%, and I looked out at the breakfast table at the 14 boys sitting around that table, and I said to myself, 4 wouldn't come home. Which 4 wouldn't come home? How would their moms feel? How would their brothers feel? How would their dads feel? So we need to be focused on that. We need to be focused on the sacrifices that were made during the Civil War. The sacrifices that were made to keep this union together. And I know we're dealing with some pretty tough political issues right now, but we need to remember that the soldiers that went to fight kept preserve the Union, and they also set free slaves. Now, one of the interpretive themes we have for the Vermont Sesquicentennial Commission is 1865, freedom and freedom deferred. It was 100 years before the Civil Rights Act was passed. 100 years of Jim Crow laws, segregation, and just injustice throughout this country, not just in the South. And so it's amazing to me that 50 years ago, the Civil Rights Act will be around in 1965. That's ancient history to those Boy Scouts that I was camping with. Many of you may remember when those laws were passed. But we need to keep focusing on telling the story, to making that connection to our past, using interpretation to bring history alive so we don't forget it. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank some people. I'm Don Paxson, and I am the founding president of the North Country Underground Railroad Historical Association. This is a very wonderful moment for me. I have to tell you that when Vivian and I started working with this program, I had really no idea what it would develop into. And Jerry asked me recently, do you know how many people are coming? And I said, no, I have no idea. And it was pretty exciting to drive up and have no place to park. I'm a historian, so I'm going to do what Donna said. I'm going to tell you some stories. But they're stories that are important to you and to us, all of us here in the North Country. Before I do that, though, I'd like to thank Jim, because you may not know this, but it was the Basin program that funded the work of the designer of the panel. And although Donna gave me credit for the work on the panel, it was actually a collaborative process, and Jim had a lot of good input in that. It really made me prove my points before they were accepted. And the National Park Service also weighed in, and although Sherry's not here today, she played a part in the process. It was a very challenging project, but I think you will be satisfied with the end result. But Jim, I don't know, none of us noticed this, and I just discovered it as I was working on this panel I'm going to talk about in a minute. The map that we chose is inaccurate. I want people, when you see the panel, when you come up and look at it, I want you to look at Lake Champlain and where it's positioned. Okay? Yeah. But it's better than some maps that don't even have Lake Champlain on them. I wanted to read Sherry Jackson's note that she sent. We actually planned to have this event today because she was scheduled to be at an Underground Railroad conference in Albany over the weekend, and because there have been budget cuts, she really couldn't make another trip up here. So we scheduled everything, and then the crisis, happened in Washington. So she did send a note. She said, I was looking forward to the Wayside Exhibit Interpretive Panel event at Rouses Point on Sunday, but I've been told that all travel has been canceled for our office due to the federal government possible shutdown. But the decision not to shut the government down came too late, so she had to cancel all of her plans. I'm hoping to visit the site and meet everyone in the future. I know that you all have worked hard, and the dedication will be a success. And the person who's worked the hardest to make this event happen is Jerry, and we really need to thank Jerry. I want to give a little understanding of what Rouses Point's old steamboat landing was like in the late 1850s, because by 1851 there was a train that went all the way from Boston to Rouses Point, and then another train that went from Rouses Point to Ogdensburg. Ogdensburg was the narrowest point on the St. Lawrence River, and most of the fugitives from slavery who came up this way were headed for the large refugee settlements in Canada West between Toronto and Windsor. And we had two major routes coming into the Champlain Valley, one from New York City with a stop in Albany and Troy. And in Albany and Troy, people could take a left and go on the Erie Canal route over to Canada West. That's the route that Harriet Tubman used and many other people. But the most direct way to get to Canada was to continue on the Champlain Canal, go on Lake Champlain, and originally before Rouses Point became the major stop, St. John was the major stop. There was no train in New York on this side of the lake until after the Civil War. And we all know what the terrain is in Vermont. It's pretty flat along the lake. So it was easy for people to go through Washington County of New York and then get into Vermont and go along the eastern side of the lake and then get to Burlington, St. Albans, and then come across. So some people came that route, but there was another major route into the area, and that was from New England, from Boston. It made the Lake Champlain area a major, major crossroads for freedom. And when Lavinia Bell came here in 1861, ironically the sign is somewhere between Texas and here, but she escaped from Texas in 1861 and arrived here at Rouses Point in January. And I want to give you an idea of what the steamboat landing terminal was like. This is a description of a tourist. And this is from 1852. Late in the evening, the 20th of August, the steamer landed us at the end of the water communication of Lake Champlain at a very extraordinary place named Rouses Point, within 1 mile of the boundary line of the United States and Canada. It requires some little detail to convey to the reader the enormous extent of bustle, confusion, business, and pleasure, all brought into focus upon an immense pier or pier of wood, an immense wharf or pier of wood running the length of some 100 feet into the lake itself. Upon the entire length of this pier is erected a large hotel, with warehouses and stores adjoining. The bedrooms are in the higher regions, whilst underneath the railway termini and offices communicate with the hotel on the right wing. Then the steam and other boats plying alongside either pier, receiving and discharging merchandise or passengers, add greatly to the businesslike character of the place. Here the Yankee is in his glory, although the confusion and noise beat even that of the Broadway in New York. This was another occasion on which the weary traveler had little chance of a night's rest, surrounded as he is by the hissing of engines, both from steam and rail, the noises of cranes, and the bustle of hundreds of passengers with their heavy luggage. That's what Rouses Point was like in the 1850s, where the Sportsmen's Club is today. Pretty exciting, huh? But I think Rouses Point is a pretty exciting place today. Okay, I want to tell you a little bit about what these mean. Can I take this?
Oh, we've got a microphone on there.
Oh, I could use that? No? I just did this over the weekend for the conference that I gave a presentation for in Albany, and I just wanted to give you a sense of why Rouses Point was so important. Okay, these are the cast of characters, some of the people that I've identified in my research. And these are routes that came up to Rouses Point, routes on freedom trails that people followed. Now, the big problem that we discovered when we started doing our research, I mentioned before that some maps are not as good as the one that's on our panel. Here's a map that was done in 1984. It was in the National Geographic. It was done to accompany an article by an expert on the Underground Railroad. But if you look at the map and you see how the routes go, they bypass Lake Champlain, and in fact, Lake Champlain isn't even there. Well, a couple of years ago, a man called me up. He lives in Bloomingdale. He said, "You're with the Underground Railroad?" I said, "Yes." He said, "I've got a bogus map, and I want you to see it." He had gotten a map in Rochester at an Underground Railroad exhibit in Rochester. The map is a replication of this map. No Lake Champlain. So I called Judy Wellman, who's an expert on the Underground Railroad in central New York, and I said, Judy, help. Here we are over here trying to get people to understand how important Lake Champlain was to the Underground Railroad, and on the western side of New York, they're not even putting the lake on their map. Well, Frank Kennelly, one of our vice presidents, and his wife Yolanda were recently at Buffalo for a conference. They went to a couple of museums, exhibits. The map is still being shown with no Lake Champlain. All right? So that's what we're about, is trying to get people to understand that this was an important part of the Underground Railroad story. So these are some of the people. This is Moses Roper. He escaped on the Champlain Canal in Lake Champlain. He was one of the early people. The earliest account that we have was 1837. We don't know the man's name. He came on the lake. He went through Clinton County, through Franklin County, St. Lawrence County. He got about 30 miles from Ogdensburg. He stopped to have a job for a while for the postman. He was chopping wood. One day the stage comes through with the mail, and the stage leaves, and the postmaster sees an envelope on the floor. Inside is a wanted notice for the man who was chopping the wood. And so the postmaster says, "Is this you?" And he confesses and said, "Yes, it is. Please, please, don't turn me in, because they'll skin me alive if you send me back." So the postmaster gives him a loaf of bread and tells him how to get across the St. Lawrence River at another point. He said, "Don't go to Ogdensburg, they'll catch you." So Ogdensburg was important very early. 1834 was when Great Britain abolished slavery in its territories. So that made Canada a real safe place. Everybody knew that. People were already there, though, before that. So, at any rate, Moses Roper escaped in the 1840s, but the other man, whose name we don't know, was a little bit earlier. So, these are some people who were in New York City: Reverend Charles Bennett Ray, Sidney Howard Gay. They sent people to Albany. This is the wife of a Baptist minister. We don't have an image of him. He's one of the martyrs of the Underground Railroad. He went to Canandaigua to give a lecture. He got into a snowstorm. He asked to stay at someone's home. The man was pro-Southern sympathizer and did not let Reverend Brown in. Reverend Brown continued, became very ill, and he died of a fever. His wife was expecting their child. They were only married for 18 months. In 18 months, they traveled 3,000 miles, including visits to Essex and Clinton counties. And Reverend Abel Brown stayed at the mansion of Noadiah Moore in Champlain. And Noadiah Moore was Underground Railroad agent in Champlain. This is Stephen Myers. He was the head of the Underground Railroad in Albany. This is a man who also was a martyr of the Underground Railroad. He died in a Maryland prison. Charles T. Torrey. People weren't just waiting in the North for people to come and knock on their door. Some people were going into the South and bringing people out. I like to say that the Civil War started long before Fort Sumter, because people were coming north to kidnap people, some of whom were free, and putting them into slavery, and people from the north were going into the South and bringing people out. So there was a lot of conflict that preceded the actual bombardment of Fort Sumter. He brought a first wagon load, 24 people in a wagon from Washington, D.C. to Albany, and they were put on a canal boat for Canada. This is Lewis Washington, a man who never had a formal education, but was a waiter in Washington, D.C., and learned how to become a lecturer by listening to the politicians. And so when he came north with the help of Charles T. Torrey, he joined Mrs. Brown's husband on the lecture circuit. And he also came into the North Country. He took the name Washington because his son was born on President Washington's birthday. And he said, "Well, that's a pretty nice name." So he gave his son the name and took the name for himself too. All right. This is Solomon Northup, who was kidnapped in Saratoga Springs. He was enslaved for 12 years. He was born free. He was born in Essex County. And he was kidnapped in Saratoga Springs. He was was enslaved for 12 years. And then a descendant of the white family that had once owned him and freed his father was given a letter that was written by a Canadian carpenter who was working for Solomon's Louisiana master. And Solomon could tell that this man was not sympathetic to slavery. As he said, you know, I was born free in New York, and I was kidnapped. And I had a rafting business, and I went to Montreal and I saw the cathedral there. And the man said, what? Is this man lying to me? So they met in secret, and Solomon told him his whole story. And the man slipped a letter in the mail back to New York, and Solomon was freed. And he came up here and lectured after he was freed. He published a narrative. It's still used in colleges. It's online. Very, very famous book. He disappeared mysteriously. Nobody knows what happened to him after that. Anyway, this is Henry Highland Garnett. He sent people up here. And this is the man, his image, another picture of him is on our panel. This is George Edward Jones, a free black man who was a barber in Montreal. His family says that they were free people. Not everybody who went to Canada had been enslaved. So people were at a disadvantage, free or enslaved in the United States. So his family went to Canada, and he used to come down across the border and see if there was anybody who needed help. And in 1861, he helped Mrs. Bell get across to Canada. These are some other people in our area. This is Rowland T. Robinson. Jim mentioned Rowland T. Robinson. Rokeby Museum is the family home. It's in Ferrisburg. I really recommend that you all visit there. It's a wonderful museum because the family lived there for generations, never threw anything out. Fortunately, because I was able to corroborate, well, actually disprove an Underground Railroad history. Wilbur Siebert was the expert on the Underground Railroad. He published a book on Vermont and the Underground Railroad, and he said that Rowland T. Robinson sent a man across Lake Champlain to Samuel Parr in Peoria, New York. Well, it stumped me for a long time because I've never heard of a Peoria, New York. Have you? No. I never heard of a Samuel Parr. Fortunately, his son wrote the letter to Wilbur Siebert, but his son was nearly blind, and you cannot read his writing. Fortunately, the original letter still exists. Houghton Library at Harvard University sent me a digitized copy. We zoomed in on it, and it says, I don't know to whom he was sent unless to Samuel Keyes in Peru, New York. Samuel Keyes was the head of the Underground Railroad in Peru. Furthermore, at Rokeby Museum, they have a diary because Rowland T. Robinson took the young man to the home of John Rogers. That home is currently owned by Art Cohn, who's with the Maritime Museum in Vermont. And anyway, John Rogers' sister Mary kept a diary and said he was 17 years old, he was being chased. Rowland T. brought the young man to their home. He stayed overnight. He was sent on McNeil's Ferry to Isaac Orvis in Toronto, Canada. Isaac Orvis was a Vermont Quaker who had moved to Toronto. That gave us a real story here, Vermont, Ferrisburg, Peru, Toronto. Okay. Now, I want to move a little bit up to, this is Noadiamor. The Quakers in Peru would send people to they would bring people up to Noadiamor, and he used to take people across the border to Lacole. This is a very wonderful woman. She was a Quaker, Elizabeth Buffum Chase. She lived with her husband in Fall River, Massachusetts. She's part of the Vermont Road. She had a very interesting way of knowing that people had arrived safely. She would give them a letter that was addressed to her and give them the instruction of sending the letter to her as soon as they got to Toronto. And then she would know that they were safe. She sent the people to Burlington, Vermont, to Reverend Joshua Young, who worked with Lucius H. Bigelow in Burlington, and sometimes they would send people across the lake at St. Albans. This is Lawrence Brainerd, who assisted people in St. Albans, sent people over here. There was a black man whose image I do not have, John W. Lewis, in the 1850s. He was sending people over to Rouses Point from St. Albans. And this is Erastus Hopkins. Erastus Hopkins was an abolitionist from Northampton, Massachusetts. In 1859, he sent a letter And the University of Vermont has this letter. They don't have too much on the Underground Railroad, but they have this priceless letter. And what it says is, I am sending you Bill. Bill is mentioned on our panel because this is documented. I am sending you Bill. For the first time, I am president of the Underground Railroad. Bill is the son of his master. Do not send him by Rouses Point, where he might be seen. He's on his way to Chatham. Send him by way of Ogdensburg. Proof of our Underground Railroad history. Wonderful, because he's sending him to Burlington. Don't send him by Rouses Point. Get him to Ogdensburg somehow. He's on his way to Chatham. That's in Canada West. So these are some documents that we found that verify the importance of Lake Champlain, the Champlain line of the Underground Railroad. This is John Brown, of course, who, after he was hanged for leading the raid at Harper's Ferry, was buried at his home in North Elba, and it was Reverend Young and Lucius H. Bigelow, the Underground Railroad agents. Young had never met Brown, but they came over in a rainstorm to the burial, and there was no minister there, so Reverend Young was invited to give a sermon. When he went back to Burlington, his congregation did not like what he had done, and they removed him from office. Okay, this is our great story, and story is mentioned on our panel. This is the story of Lavinia Bell. Lavinia Bell was born free in Washington, D.C. When she was a child, she was kidnapped and sold into slavery in Texas. She had an extremely cruel owner. I won't give you all the details of the punishments that he inflicted on her, but she wanted to be free, and she married a man named Henry Bell. They ran away together, and they were caught. And her husband was beaten so badly he died. She was pregnant, and she ran away again, and she got to a place called the Shades of Death in Mississippi. We haven't been able to find it. We don't know where it's located. And maybe it has a different name today, we don't know. But anyway, she gave birth to twins, and one of the babies died. She was caught, taken back, punished. Every time she ran away, she was punished very severely. She waited about a year, and then she ran away again. She left her child, her surviving child, with somebody to take care of the boy. So she escaped again. She got to Louisiana. She went to the Shades of Death. She got her son. She got up to Warren County, Illinois, and a black man sold her for $250 to Natchez, Mississippi. She escaped. She got to Richmond, Virginia. She broke out of jail. She got to away from there a little distance. Then she got over to Bardstown, Kentucky. Her child is taken away from her. She escapes again, back and forth into Ohio, back to Bardstown. Finally, she breaks out and she gets to New York. Now, we have to imagine what happened, because in her narrative it says she went to Watertown and then to Whitehall. It doesn't make sense. How would she have done that? What I surmise is that she went on the Erie Canal route, and she got to Syracuse and went up toward Watertown. For some reason decided not to go into Canada there, came back to Syracuse, then came over to Whitehall, which was the southernmost point on Lake Champlain where people boarded steamboats. And then, however, the thing is that in 1861 in January, you wouldn't have been able to take a steamboat on the lake because it would have been frozen. So she probably went through Vermont and then was sent over the lake somehow, but she got to Rouses Point in January of 1861. She was extremely ill when she got to Canada. She was taken to a refugee family who cared for her, called a doctor in, and he checked her out, and her story was on the front page of 3 newspapers in Montreal. That's how we know her story. On the day that Fort Sumter was fired on, Mrs. Bell and another a black man signed a lease for a dwelling in Montreal. 1 month later, the dwelling was rented to someone else. We don't know what happened to her. All we know is that what she wanted more than anything was to earn $250 so she could buy the freedom of her son. And we don't know if she was able to do that or not. But these are some of the stories. that this marker will commemorate. I want to echo what people said before about this being a memorial for all the people who were related to, in some way, who lived here in those days, and were supportive to the people who were seeking freedom. It says a lot about the character of the people here. And you, being here today, are playing a major part in putting this big story on the map. This is an international story, and that's why the National Park Service was so excited about it. As far as I know, this marker is the closest to the border of any of the markers they've done so far. I also want to mention one last thing. You'll probably be hearing about this in the paper, but we are opening our museum. We're having our ribbon cutting on May the 14th at Au Sable Chasm. We're telling the story of the Champlain line of the Underground Railroad. We'll be opening for the public on May 21st. This is a big year for us. So all of you are welcome to come, and I'm looking at your faces now. I may not know your names, but I think I'll remember your faces when you come to see us. So thank you very much.
Well, I want to say thank you to all the wonderful speakers. Weren't they great? All of them. They all gave us a different perspective. We're going to make a little bit of an rearrangement here. Yes. Yeah. And if we could have Ashley, Emma, and Logan, who are students from the Rouses Point Elementary, grade 3. They're going to help Jackie Madison to unveil the panel.
Okay, this moment, these lovely young children will help me get this up. So let's start raising it up. There we go.
One thing I want to point out on the panel, up here in the corner, you see that little symbol? It's called, I'm just learning about this, it's a QR symbol or a quick response symbol. And what it is, if you have a smartphone, you do something to that symbol, you take a picture or something of it, somebody who knows about it will have to explain it to you better than me. And it will take you to the website for the Underground Railroad, Don Patson's website. And this is the first one in our area. And that's part of the reason our panel is a little bit delayed, because we wanted to get that symbol on there. So it'll be worth it. Thank you. So again, we're going to set Lita back up, and she's going to entertain us for a little while this afternoon, and then after that we're going to have some light refreshments. And thank you again for everybody that came out this afternoon. It's very, very important to us.
There seems to be a thread that's been sewn among the speakers, throughout the visuals, and throughout everyone who's here today. And that thread is that things can happen. Only in America can things happen the way they do. When things are wrong, they can be righted. That there's always that hope. That big H is so important. And America, as we know, is not just the United States, it's Canada, it is Mexico. And freedom is important to everyone. So I would like to start with the song America, My Country 'Tis of Thee, be it whichever country it is. It's very important, and in all of our honors. Let's sing this together, okay? My country 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Let all of our leaders. We know that some people didn't have the opportunity to have their hearts be thrilled. Not until there was hope, not until Nat Turner and some other things showed them that yes, people could be free, if only for a little while, and it's a possibility. And that possibility came to term, a lot of it came to term right here in Rouses Point. If you think of Lavinia Bell and Harriet Tubman, who went through an awful lifetime before she developed a new free lifetime. The song, I Wish I Knew How It Would Feel to Be Free, makes a lot of sense. I'm Irish, and I'm named Mike Kelly, and a mother with a Lynch. You know I'm Irish. And the one thing people don't really realize is that in our history and in our heritage, there was slavery there too. The English were in the business of getting rid of their Irish counterparts, and they sent them down into the West Indies and over here. And so there was Irish slavery here, sometimes worse than it was for the African Americans. And it's important to me, knowing that and wondering if my heritage had slavery in it, which is possible, to be able to try and understand the thoughts behind this song. I wish that I knew how it feels to be free. I wish I could break all these chains binding me. I wish I could say all the things I should say. Say 'em loud, say 'em clear, for the whole world to hear. I wish that I could share the love in my heart. Remove all the bars that still keep us apart. I wish you could know what it feels to be me. Then you see and agree, every man should be free. I wish I could feel all I'm longing to feel. I wish I could live like I'm longing to live. I wish I could do all the things I can do. Oh, I'm way overdue. I'd be starting anew. I wish I knew how it would feel to be free. I wish I could break all these chains binding me. I wish I could say all the things I should say. Then I'd know, yes I know how it feels to be free. And I know how it feels to be free. One thing that I love about some some of the old gospel music is the way it turned and changed as needs would arise. Sometimes the meanings of the words in some of the old songs weren't what you thought they were. That was purposely done. Other times they were just blatant, straight out. I've linked together some songs that actually had recommended to me by Don Papson, and one that I picked up, and they're like a call and response. Someone will start it and you'll know soon what's coming up, and so you're always invited to sing. You don't need to read it to be able to sing. You just need to have heart and a voice that wants to get something out. First song is called Guide My Feet, and the second was called Oh Freedom. Guide my feet while I run this race. Guide my feet now while I run this race. Oh, guide my feet while I run this race. 'Cause I don't want to run this race in vain. I need you to hold my hand while I run this race. I want you to hold my hand while I run this race. Won't you hold my hand while I run this race? 'Cause I don't want to run this race in vain. Dedicated to the people here at Rouses Point that held a lot of hands and held a lot of hearts. I need you to stand by me, stand by me. While I run this race, I need you to stand by me. While I run this race, oh yes, now stand by me. While I run this race, 'cause I don't want no more fighting, no more fighting, no more fighting, no more fighting over me. And before I'd be a slave, I'd be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. Thank you. It's been a pleasure and an honor to be here, and now it's a great time for everyone to talk and enjoy each other. Share the stories that weren't told here. Thank you.